Welcome. Welcome to the Cirque du Freak.
Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be looking at a series that's been requested a lot, Cirque du Freak, or the Saga of Darren Shan. The movie Cirque du Freak, The Vampire's Assistant came out in 2009. It features some amazing actors like John C. Reilly, Willem Dafoe, Salma Hayek, Josh Hutcherson, Chris Masoglia, and more. The film was based on the beloved novel series called The Saga of Darren Shan, written by Darren O'Shaughnessy. In total, the horror fantasy thriller series has 12 books. The film, instead of being based on one book, they decided to make a loose adaptation of the first 3 books into one film. The first book is called Cirque du Freak, A Living Nightmare. The second book is called The Vampire's Assistant, and the third, The Tunnels of Blood. So they combined the titles of the first 2 books to make the movie title. There's also a manga. I will be talking about the movie, of course, but since it was supposed to have sequels, it leaves a lot to be explained, so I'll be using the books as reference. Since the movie and the characters are adapted from the books, you could say it's all canon. So let's take a look at the vampires, Vampaneze, and a few other supernaturals in the circus. The movie starts off with Darren going to school, and we see he has lots of friends, good grades, but his best friend Steve is a bit of a troublemaker. The two are at school talking about Darren being grounded when a strange car accompanied by fog and mysterious music drives by. As it drove by, a flyer comes out of the car and lands on the ground. Darren picks it up and reads, Cirque du Freak, one night only. The world's greatest freak show, 500 years. That night, Darren sneaks out and the two friends head to the theater. This is when Steve points out the moon, and Darren sarcastically says, "Did you read that in one of your vampire books?" He explains that Steve is obsessed with vampires and he is obsessed with spiders. The two then approach the theater, but the ticket booth is empty. Suddenly a small piece of paper is thrown out that says money. Steve holds out the money and says we need 2 tickets. We don't get to see much, but it's some kind of small creature. It bites Steve's hand, but they do get their tickets. I always thought it was gross that after he's bitten by this weird little creature, he immediately puts his hand in his mouth. Anyway, when they go inside, they're greeted by Hibernius Tall, the owner of the circus. His age is never mentioned specifically, but he is at least 1200 years old. He has telepathic abilities and can even see future events, although he is usually extremely vague when sharing the details of these premonitions. He can also move extremely fast while making what seems like no noise. Some people wonder if he can teleport. Some people don't like some of the changes made to the movie adaptation, but I have to say I really like Mr. Tall, and the actor does a great version of him.
Go ahead in. Show's about to start.
Mr. Tall welcomes Darren and Steve into the circus and they have a seat. Mr. Tall says, "Welcome to Cirque du Freak, the oldest continuously running freak show in the Western Hemisphere. We have been touring for 500 years, bringing the bizarre to generation after generation. May I present the Wolfman." The Wolfman seems to be some kind of werewolf, one that is permanently stuck in wolf form. The Wolfman goes out into the crowd and suddenly rips a woman's arm off and the crowd panics. Someone yells to call an ambulance, but Mr. Tall assures everyone that's not necessary. The woman walks up on stage and her arm begins to regrow. She's part of the circus and her ability is regrowing her limbs at will. And I guess they feel no pain too. Next is Alexander Ribs. I think you can tell what makes him different. He can also contort himself, and in the books he can play his ribs like an xylophone and perform popular theme songs. Gertha Teeth is a woman whose teeth are so strong she can bite through steel like it's bread. Ramus Two Bellies has an act consisting of eating huge amounts of food incredibly fast and being able to swallow and regurgitate impressive objects. Ever the Snake Boy is just that, a snake boy. His skin is made up of scales and his eyes are just like a snake. He also has the ability to communicate with snakes, being able to make his pet dance. Next is the insightful Madame Truska. She has the ability to grow a beard at will. In the movie, she has to cut it off, but in the book, she can actually retract her beard. And the hair that makes up her beard is unnaturally strong, almost uncuttable. Her most important ability is probably her premonitions about the future. She will get these flashes of visions and sometimes say words. During her performance, she calls Darren on stage. She gets a strange vision, causing her to end her performance early, and she tells the next performer not to go out, but he does anyway. Larton Crepsley and Madame Octa. I think by far the best character in the movie. Crepsley suddenly appears in the blink of an eye and informs the crowd that his spider has escaped, so be careful retrieving things from under your seat. He takes off his hat and the spider pops out, startling Crepsley. He goes on to tell the crowd that one bite from the spider can kill, so he needs his flute because he has trained the spider with it. He starts playing the flute and him and the spider begin putting on an impressive act. In the crowd, a shocked Steve informs Darren that his name is not Larton Crepsley, it's Verhorsten, and he's a vampire. Steve says that he has seen him in a painting in one of his vampire books. Suddenly Madame Octa lands on Darren's lap and everyone freaks out, except Darren. He just stares at the spider. Crepsley walks over and says, "Can I have my spider back?" He then says, "Now boys, vampires don't exist. But if one did and he thought someone knew, he might smother them in their sleep." Suddenly the angry townspeople burst in, putting an end to the show. Darren and Steve leave, but after seeing Madame Octa, Darren was obsessed, so he made the crazy decision after being threatened to go back into the theater and sneak into Crepsley's room and steal Madame Octa. While in the room, Darren hears Crepsley coming and has to hide. Crepsley and another vampire, Gavner Pearl, enter and begin talking. Gavner is worried because the Vampaneze are slowly killing off vampires and he's worried that they might be next. Vampaneze used to be vampires, but are now just a relative. They are described as having purple skin, red hair, red eyes, and red nails. However, in the movie, they look almost identical to vampires. Vampires at one time fed on and killed humans at will, but eventually they realized their lives would be a lot easier if they didn't kill all their victims. The Vampaneze, on the other hand, are much more ruthless and want to kill everyone they feed on, this causing them to become the Vampaneze. Although they are bloodthirsty by nature, they do not kill only for the sake of bloodlust. They kill because they believe that when they feed and kill, a piece of the person's soul lives on within them. For a long time after the split, there was peace between the vampires and Vampaneze. That was until Mr. Tiny came along. Gavner informs Crepsley that Mr. Tiny is back, and this seems to frighten him, and he asks, "He's back from the other side?" Gavner says yes, and he was at the council library messing with the Book of Souls. That doesn't sound good. Gavner is under the impression that Mr. Tiny wants to destroy them all, and he might just be right. As Crepsley and Gavner are talking, Steve bursts through the door. The hidden Darren, in shock, watches Steve ask to be turned into a vampire. Crepsley refuses. Steve tells him how much he hates his life and pleads for him to turn him into a vampire. Crepsley tries telling him it's a depressing life being a vampire. You have to give up your friends and family and live a life of solitude. Plus, they have rules, and one of them is children cannot become vampires. Crepsley tastes Steve's blood anyway and tells him he has bad blood and could never be a vampire. This infuriates Steve. He threatens that Crepsley will regret this and then leaves.
He's just an idiot kid who should be leaving right now.
Darren escapes with the spider, but as he gets outside, the same car from the beginning of the movie pulls up. Inside is Mr. Tiny with his henchman Merlot. Mr. Tiny tells Darren to jump in and he quickly does so. A moment later, Crepsley steps out into the alleyway, so he's seen Darren go with Mr. Tiny. Tiny asks if he is the one known as Steve, but he replies no, he's the one known as Darren. So Mr. Tiny was looking for Steve for some reason. Merlot seems to be convinced that Darren is nothing more than a bag of blood, but Tiny says he thinks Darren has great potential, and plucks a hair off his head, putting it into a small case, probably for some kind of magic DNA test. Tiny drops Darren off at home and before leaving has Darren's bike ejected from the trunk about 100 feet into the air. This shows he has some kind of magical abilities. The next day at school, Steve catches Darren talking to his backpack. Steve tries to look inside and finds Madame Octa. Steve is shocked and probably a little scared. He tells Darren, "You stole from a vampire? You're a dead man." While Steve is looking at the spider, suddenly the school bell rings, startling Steve, causing him to drop the cage. This makes the door of the cage pop open and lets out Madame Octa. After a big struggle and many scared kids, Madame Octa bites Steve on the face, causing him to instantly fall unconscious and drop to the ground. Steve is now in the hospital, and Darren knows from the show that the spider bite is fatal. He has no choice but to go to Crepsley and admit what he did and hope that he can help Steve. Darren goes back to the theater and Crepsley appears, calling him a thief. Crepsley also asks Darren what did Mr. Tiny want, but Darren says I don't know, something about destiny. Crepsley tells him that Mr. Tiny doesn't take an interest in just anyone, and the people he does take an interest in wind up dead. Or worse.
What's worse than dead?
Oh. Lots of things.
Crepsley reluctantly agrees to save Darren from Mr. Tiny, and save Steve even though he threatened him. But in return, Darren must become his assistant. He will be made into a half-vampire so he can still go out in the daylight. Very useful to run errands or guard Crepsley's coffin. Full vampires can go out in the sun, but their skin will turn red in about 20 minutes and 4 to 5 hours will kill them. Crepsley first gives Darren's blood a test, just like Steve's, to see if he'll make a good half-vampire. He says, yes, your blood is good, this will work. This is like a form of divination. Vampires can somehow detect whether someone can be turned evil or not. People with bad blood don't always become evil, but they're much more likely to. Crepsley turns Darren into a half-vampire by pricking the ends of his fingers with his nails and then exchanging a small amount of blood through the wounds. Crepsley warns Darren this might hurt when it reaches his heart. A moment later he drops to the ground in pain, but before he knew it, the pain was gone. He stands up and Crepsley tells him to lick his fingers, and as he does, the wounds instantly close. A vampire's saliva has magical healing properties that can heal most wounds instantly and can speed up the healing of larger wounds, breaks, or bruises. They can also use their spit to heal others. Vampires often do this to heal their victims' wounds after feeding. The Vampaneze have the same healing spit as well. Crepsley says that Darren's other vampire abilities will come soon, such as being able to infuse their breath with a chemical like chloroform that will render a victim unconscious, very useful for feeding. They usually breathe into their hand and then place their hand over the victim's face. A half-vampire only has a small amount of vampire blood in their system. They must still consume human blood from time to time to keep their strength, but not as much as a full vampire. They can be fully turned by giving them more vampire blood. This is known as being fully blooded. When a vampire is fully turned, they must complete the trials of initiation or they will be sentenced to death. In the book, half-vampires are missing a lot of the abilities that full vampires have. They do not have healing spit, they do not have telepathy, knockout breath, cannot use the ability flit, and more. But in the movies, we see the half-vampires have at least some of these abilities. Crepsley also states that if a human were to somehow ingest half-vampire blood, they would not gain any vampiric abilities, but might live slightly longer than a normal human. Unlike in most series, these vampires do not live forever, but they will live considerably longer than a human. A vampire will age 1 year for every 10 human years, so they basically live 10 times as long. And some can probably live longer. Half-vampires age 1 year for every 5 human years, so still very long. Vampires also have to consume regular food to survive and must consume blood at least once a month to maintain their abilities and slower aging. If a vampire goes a considerable amount of time without blood, they will actually begin to age faster than a human, 20 to 30 years in 1 human year. Animal blood can sustain them for a while, but not forever. A vampire must be very careful when consuming animal blood because some animal blood is like poison to them. Some animals that vampires cannot feed on are monkeys, fish, frogs, cats, snakes, and more. Even the character in the book doesn't learn all the animals that vampires cannot feed from. Crepsley tells Darren that it's always just best to ask before he feeds on an animal. Vampires cannot turn into a bat or fly, but they have some affinity with animals. Bats and rats will be drawn to them and will obey them. But on the other hand, cats and dogs hate vampires. Can they be seen in mirrors? Yes. But they cannot be seen in photographs or video. This is apparently caused by the vampire's atoms behaving differently. Strange. I think one of the most defining features of these vampires is that they do not have fangs. Their teeth are very strong and are more than capable of biting through skin and bone, but as Crepsley says, it's messy. Vampires usually use their extremely sharp nails to cut the victim and then drink from the wound.
We just make a small incision in his shoulder, right here.
Now that Darren is a half-vampire and has agreed to become Crepsley's assistant, they go to the hospital where Steve is. Crepsley has Darren climb on his back, and after using his flit ability, Darren cannot breathe.
Did I not tell you to hold your breath? Oh, sorry.
Flitting is when a vampire uses their speed combined with their natural magic to achieve an even faster speed, allowing them to travel huge distances almost instantly. Crepsley scales up the wall with Darren on his back. Once in the room, Steve looks pretty bad from the spider bite. Crepsley takes some of the antidote and I think some of his spit and gives it to Steve. A moment later, he stirs to life. Suddenly, Darren hits the alarm buttons, showing he had no intention of being Crepsley's assistant, he just wanted to save Steve. Crepsley tells him that being a vampire is difficult and don't do anything stupid like kill your family. Guess what Darren does? Okay, well he didn't kill his family, but he almost killed his sister. This is when Crepsley returns and tells him that he must leave his family behind. He gives Darren a vial and says drink. This is some kind of potion that will make him appear dead. He then quickly breaks Darren's neck and says sorry, they never would have believed you were dead, and then rolls him off the roof, making it look like Darren accidentally fell off the roof and broke his neck. At the funeral, Steve is mourning over Darren when he notices the scars on his fingertips. We learned earlier that Steve is obsessed with vampires and he's kind of an expert on them, so he knows exactly what these marks are from. He starts yelling at Darren to wake up, but he doesn't, and someone comes over and tells him to stop. That night, after being buried, Crepsley comes back to the grave and digs up Darren, now a half-vampire who is dead to the world. After climbing out of the grave, Crepsley uses his advanced senses and says, "Do you smell rotting flesh?" Darren thinks this is a joke because he's a new half-vampire, but he's smelling something else. Vampaneze. Merlot tries to ambush them in the graveyard, but Crepsley is able to fight him off. The two show their impressive strength, and Crepsley uses his ability called Flit to get away. Vampires have supernatural speed and can react and move to things in the blink of an eye. Crepsley takes Darren to stay at the freak show for now. Mr. Tall allows him to stay temporarily. He's afraid since Mr. Tiny has taken an interest in Darren that he puts everyone at the circus at risk. Darren stays with Evra the snake boy and meets a girl he grows very fond of, Rebecca the monkey girl. She's got a tail. At the same time, his friend Steve is still mourning over Darren and isn't sure if he wants to go on. But that's when Mr. Tiny arrives. He confirms to Steve that Darren is still alive and offers Steve a chance to fulfill his destiny and become Vampaneze. Steve agrees and then shortly after kills his high school teacher, Mr. Kersey, showing Steve is fully embracing the Vampaneze way. Mr. Tiny's goal seems to be to make Darren and Steve have some kind of confrontation. He loves chaos and wants nothing more than a good war. He has Darren's parents and Rebecca the monkey girl kidnapped and leaves a flyer for the circus in Darren's house. Darren of course goes after his family and Rebecca and finds them tied up in the theater. Darren is confused about what's going on, and suddenly Steve walks out and pretends to be shocked. "Oh my god, Darren, you're alive? Yeah, that was real nice of you to make your family and best friend believe you were dead." Darren tries to explain he only did it to save Steve, but it's no use. Steve gives Darren a choice. Kill Rebecca, and he'll let his family go. According to Steve, this is all part of Mr. Tiny's plan. Unwilling to choose between Rebecca and his family, Darren begins fighting with Steve, and Crepsley fights Merlot. Darren is at a significant disadvantage for most of the fight since he hasn't been feeding on blood like Steve. Darren is afraid that if he feeds on blood, he'll lose the last bit of him that's human. Mid-fight, Rebecca manages to convince him that that's not true and offers him some blood, and he takes it, knowing that it might be his only way to survive. Crepsley and Merlot have a pretty good back and forth. I like the part where they're throwing the dagger and stopping it with their hand and then immediately closing the wound. Melee weapons or thrown weapons like this dagger are some of the only weapons that vampires are allowed to use. This is because it's against vampire law to use anything like a gun or bow and arrow. Crepsley does his best, but eventually Merlot gets the best of him. Darren, after just feeding, sees Crepsley is about to be killed by being stabbed in the heart. Now charged with blood, Darren attempts to flit and smacks right into Steve, sending him flying. Crepsley then quickly grabs the dagger and stabs Merlot. As soon as this happens, we see a big smile on Mr. Tiny's face. Merlot, with his dying breath, says that he will be avenged, and now the truce between vampires and Vampaneze is over. This was Mr. Tiny's plan all along. He probably didn't even care who was killed, as long as the truce was broken. The war has now begun.
100 years is over. The war begins.
Vampires and Vampaneze can be killed. They're not indestructible, just a lot tougher. They can be killed by anything piercing their heart. A stake, a knife, a bullet, anything. They can also be killed by, say, being crushed by a car or even drowned. They don't have any of the traditional vampire weaknesses though, such as crosses, holy water, or garlic. After the fight in the theater, Crepsley uses his vampire abilities to hypnotize Darren's parents so they won't remember what happened at the theater. What's interesting is Crepsley says the hypnotizing works on memories, but not emotions, so they will always have the feeling that you're out there. Darren goes back to live at the circus with Crepsley, and Mr. Tall takes a vote to make Darren a permanent member, and he's accepted in. All is well for Darren at the moment, but there's now a war brewing between vampires and Vampaneze, and it looks like they won't be staying at the circus for long. We see Steve is with Mr. Tiny, and he is now the leader of the Vampaneze. Mr. Tiny asks him, "Are you ready to meet your people?" And he gets in the car. In the movie, you're led to believe that Darren and Steve were just best friends, but they're actually half brothers. And guess who their father is? That's right, Mr. Tiny. He somehow imprinted himself onto Darren and Steve's mother. Mr. Tiny is also the father of Mr. Tall, the owner of the Cirque du Freak, so technically Darren and Mr. Tall are brothers. This is probably why Madame Truska could sense something very different about Darren, because he's related to Mr. Tiny. Desmond Tiny is very mysterious. No one really knows the extent of his power, but it seems limitless. His full name is Desmond Tiny. Sometimes he tells people to call him Des, as in Des Tiny, Destiny. He has a gift for planting ideas in people's heads and getting them to cause mass chaos. Tiny is father to Mr. Tall, Darren, Steve, and Lady Ivana. Darren and Steve were created by Mr. Tiny imprinting himself on their mothers. However, Ivana and Mr. Tall were created after a vampire begged Mr. Tiny to allow vampires to have children. By mixing vampire blood with a pregnant wolf and using some strange charms, he managed to create Mr. Tall and Ivana, a new kind of species that would be able to mate with vampires. Mr. Tiny is said to have future-seeing abilities and can even time travel, and can control dragons. He is also the one who created the Little People. We see at the end of the film, after Merlot is killed, that he is brought back by Mr. Tiny as a little person. But I don't think this is a good fate. Earlier, Crepsley says that he doesn't like to cross Mr. Tiny because he has the ability to kill people and bring them back, and I plan on staying dead. So becoming one of these creatures is maybe for some a gift, but for most it's a horrible curse, forced to live and serve Mr. Tiny. At one point, vampires could roam at all hours and had little to no weakness. That was until Mr. Tiny changed that. He used his powers to take away some of theirs. It's also speculated that vampires may have actually came from wolves, but nobody knows for sure. Desmond Tiny is believed to be the most powerful being in the world. People speculate that he might be truly immortal. He is known as one of the creatures of chaos. He must obey the laws of the universe or risk releasing his elder family and brothers. They are known as the Hounds of Chaos. If set free, they would cause nothing but misery throughout the world. Desmond Tiny is definitely one of my favorite characters from this franchise, and he looks really cool in the manga.
Drink some blood, you'll be able to do all kinds of things.
Personally, I really like this movie. I just ignore the bad parts. Most of the characters are great, and I love the wider lore of the series. I think it had so much potential, but some unfortunate writing and the decisions to adapt 3 books into one movie caused it to fall flat for a wider audience. And now because of this first disaster, we'll probably never see another film installment of this amazing book series, and that's a shame. The tone of this movie was off. Some parts were like they were straight out of a kid's movie like Halloween Town, and other scenes were something clearly for an adult or young adult audience. It was like they couldn't decide if they wanted to make a movie for kids or teenagers. They'll have really corny scenes like this.
It's not about what you are, it's about who you are.
But then also have scenes like these.
Your damn nose is off. I'm gonna ram my head up your ass.
I found stretches of the movie with the character Darren felt more childish, but as soon as he wasn't on screen, the movie changed and I was interested again. I think that possibly the actors that played Darren and Steve should have switched roles, and I think that might have helped the movie. I think another reason the movie feels all over the place is again, they're trying to cram 3 books into one movie. They mention so many things offhandedly that mean nothing to us and they never come back up. At the beginning of the movie, they're talking about some guy named Vincent being killed, the Mofrikins, and the Book of Souls. Yeah, none of that's ever mentioned again. The weird thing is they used 3 books to make this one movie, but somehow I feel like the movie begins halfway through a book and also feels like it ends halfway through a book. It's okay to set up a sequel. I mean, look at Karate Kid and Back to the Future, but the movie still has to stand on its own. In the end, I'll give this movie a 6 out of 10, but I still really like watching this movie and I've probably watched it like 20 times. If you can get past some of its imperfections, I think it's really enjoyable, so if you haven't seen it, definitely give it a shot. Or try your hand at the books because they're definitely top tier. That's my video on The Vampire's Assistant / The Saga of Darren Shan. This movie doesn't get talked about much, and I haven't even seen anyone talk about the books before, so thanks a lot to you guys for recommending this series to me. If there's any other movies, TV shows, or anything you want me to check out, leave it in the comments below. If you enjoyed, leave a like, and maybe subscribe if you haven't. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.